Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. With military action between India and Pakistan looking increasingly imminent, how does the Trump administration view this escalating crisis? Although the US President and Vice President immediately expressed sympathy, do they accept Pahalgam is the work of a Pakistani terrorist organization? And how does the Trump administration view the measures India and Pakistan have taken? Finally, if it does come to military action, would the White House act to restrain both countries as it did in 2019? Those are the key issues I should raise today with one of America's most highly regarded experts on South Asia, a senior fellow from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Daniel Markey. Dr. Markey joins us live from Washington, D.C. Dr. Markey, let me start by asking, how does the Trump administration actually view the escalating India-Pakistan crisis? On the one hand, President Trump has said that the Kashmir dispute is 1,000 years old and they'll get it figured out one way or the other. On the other hand, the State Department has said that they're in touch with both governments at multiple levels and they're encouraging them to work towards a responsible resolution. So what do you believe is the actual US government position on this crisis?
Well, I think what you're getting at, Karan, in that question is a bit of a distinction or a gap between what I perceive as being the White House's position and what I perceive as being the State Department or the sort of broader bureaucracy within the foreign policy establishment's position on this issue. The former, that is the president, I think is otherwise occupied. I think he has a lot of other things that he's more focused on. I think that his point about how India and Pakistan would resolve this themselves is more of a wish than a practical reality, reflects the fact that his mind is broadly or generally elsewhere. I think the State Department, which is populated by more of your professional foreign policy experts and so on, is rightly, in my view, concerned about this issue and seeking to find a way to introduce a degree of restraint as soon as possible, because what is most, I think, on their minds is the question of escalation. And we can get to this, but I think their principal concern is that while India may have every reason to strike first, it's not clear who strikes last or how this would be resolved, and that worries them a lot.
I'll come to escalation in a moment's time, Dr. Markey, but let me begin with a few preliminary questions. Does the Trump administration accept India's claim that Pahalgam is the work of the Resistance Front, an offshoot of the Lashkar-e-Taiba, which the United States and the United Nations considered a terrorist organization? I noticed an article in the New York Times a couple of days ago suggested that Western diplomats, when they were briefed by the Indian Foreign Secretary, were not completely convinced with the evidence India had so far shared. So are there question marks about whether America actually accepts the Resistance Front did this?
Look, I can't in any way speak for the US government, certainly. What I would say is that narrowly, they may have their doubts, but broadly, they don't. So narrowly, and in the immediate context, there will be questions about evidence and about whether there is a clear link between these attackers and patrons back in Pakistan. They would want to see that, ideally, to ascribe blame. And some diplomats would hold on to that as a reason to sort of wait and see, to have more of an investigation and so on. But back in Washington, I think there's also an acceptance of a broader reality, a pattern of facts that terrorism in India has repeatedly had a Pakistani source, and that India has reasons, good reasons, to suspect that this attack would be no different. So more broadly, there's a sympathy for India on this issue, and a sense that India generally is on the right side with respect to combating Islamist terrorism. And therefore, that it's not surprising that India would have jumped to this conclusion quickly, even if it doesn't maybe yet have all of the dots connected between this attack and back to Pakistan.
It sounds as if they're willing to give India a certain benefit of doubt, because so often in the past, there has been a Pakistani source to the terror India has experienced. In other words, what they're saying is, we're happy to accept in the interim that you have reasons to believe, based upon the past, that Pakistan is involved this time around, but we would like to see firmer, more relevant evidence when you have it.
Yeah, and the question is whether anybody back in Washington would really, anybody in a position of power would say, look, India, you need to wait to take actions until we're satisfied with the evidence. And there, I'm not concerned that that's the dominant message that Washington is delivering. Certainly not yet.
Let me put to you something that a few Indian papers have noticed. So far, both President Trump and Vice President Vance, who happened to be in India when Pahalgam happened, have expressed their sympathy. But America has not explicitly criticized Pakistan nor called upon Islamabad to bring the perpetrators to justice. How do you read that?
Well, this comes back to the point that the United States itself doesn't appear to have any evidence directly linking these attacks to Pakistan, and therefore is reluctant to jump to that conclusion on its own. So there's a difference between what it's the benefit of the doubt that it may extend to India, at least in the near term, and its own conclusions, which I think it's simply a question of it's too early to say. But if you were to quiz U.S. intelligence analysts, I think you would quickly reach the conclusion that they're fairly confident that there's at least a general connection between these attacks and Pakistan. What they don't know, and what they never know, and what's always very difficult to tell, is precisely why these attacks happened when they did, how much they were under the direct orders of anyone from on high in Pakistan, how much they were freelancing, and so on. And sometimes you get answers to these questions and sometimes you don't. And they know that.
Now, roughly 36 hours ago, and this was widely reported in the Indian papers and the Western press as well, the Indian Prime Minister has given the Indian military freedom to choose when to strike. And Khwaja Asif, the Pakistani defense minister, has told Reuters that as a result, he believes Indian military action is imminent. What's the informed view in Washington? Do you sense that military action is imminent?
I do, yes. But that's based more on, of course, these comments and statements. I don't have access to intelligence, so I can't say that I'm seeing anything, but there would be people within the US government who'd be watching carefully to see anything in the way of movements on the Indian side of the border and to see whether anything's going on there. Of course, the Pakistanis would be watching closely. But the principal reason for believing this is that it falls within the playbook that we've seen before, that an attack would happen, whether in 2019, 2016, previously. It would take a little bit of time for India to respond to the immediate outrage and to try to clean up the situation as best as possible. And then it would need to ready some response, and would need to determine what that is. So that would take at least days, if not a couple of weeks. And then it would act. And the fear, of course, on our side is that we will be returning to that familiar playbook. And certainly in Washington, the concern is that that first step, while completely understandable and maybe even legitimate, certainly isn't outside the bounds of what the United States itself would do if attacked. leads to very uncertain next steps. And that's where the fear and the desire for a degree of restraint and a desire to slow down the process on the U.S. part comes in.
I'll come to what you call that familiar playbook in a moment's time, but is there any speculation in Washington as to what sorts of action India could take? I presume that they won't repeat either the surgical strikes of 2016 or the Balakot strike of 2019. So is there any speculation about what they might attempt this time?
Well, there is absolutely speculation, but probably, and certainly mine, not very well informed in terms of not being able to get into the mind of your prime minister or your military. But to the extent that what we believe we've learned from the past is that the 2019 attack, although portrayed as a success, India's strike on Pakistan portrayed as a success by the Indian government, was not seen as a success internationally. It was seen as an errant strike. And so this time, presumably, if something similar were undertaken, and that seems about right, it would probably be more effective because India would have had more time to plan it. And it might, in fact, be more spectacular in ways that your prime minister has already suggested, principally because India would feel the need to reestablish, in its view, a deterrent that clearly broke down, and to suggest also to the Indian public that this government is serious about defending India and will exact a retribution if these attacks take place. So something beyond what we saw before, that wouldn't be sufficient. And that, of course, even in the last time, we saw a Pakistani response to that. And as I say, that's where we get off to the races and why the United States would like to slow everything down and introduce some caution and restraint into the story.
Now, last night, Marco Rubio, your Secretary of State, rang both the Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and also our Foreign Minister Jai Shankar. Do you have any sense of what sort of message he got back? Is he able to exercise restraint and to suggest, look, military action is inadvisable? Or do you think that he met with a blank wall in Delhi?
Do I think that India's response was basically to give him the cold shoulder? I honestly don't know. The fact that he got through to the Indian government is, although in my view, somewhat revealing. We do believe from study of previous crises that when either India or Pakistan was absolutely intent on taking action and believed that the United States might use its leverage to stop that action, phone calls simply didn't get through. They weren't answered. The attempt would be to schedule them and they wouldn't happen. Ambassadors would be ignored, wouldn't be given meetings. And so that silence from the other side was usually the best evidence that something was impending. And frankly, to be clear, we've received that silence both from India and Pakistan in 2019 at different times. So the pattern we've experienced before is if they take the call, maybe that's a good sign in itself. If they don't even take the call, that's not a good sign. So maybe this is a bit of a good sign from a U.S. perspective and the perspective of restraint. But frankly, I wouldn't bet on it. And I don't know exactly how that conversation went down. So I can't say.
Of course, the big question is what happens after India does strike, if India does strike. In 2019, the Balakot strike was followed by a Pakistani dogfight, a retaliation, where India lost a plane and it also had one of its pilots captured. Mike Pompeo, who was then your Secretary of State, in his autobiography has written that he stepped in the early hours of the morning to ensure that the two nuclear-powered nations didn't actually attempt to nuke each other. I assume that if India does carry out a strike and there's a Pakistani retaliation, Marco Rubio will be deeply involved in doing what Pompeo attempted in 2019.
Presumably. Look, I wasn't in government in 2019. I wasn't there in the room or on the phone with Pompeo and his attempts to reduce the tensions then. But I, having looked at that episode, was, I would say, underwhelmed by the United States' ability to calm tensions between the two sides. My conclusion from that previous episode, it was less a matter of U.S. leverage or pressure or inducements or anything else, and more a matter of both India and Pakistan coming to the realization or believing, frankly, that they'd achieved their aims, narrow as they might have been. India to punish Pakistan and to be perceived as having punished Pakistan. Pakistan, for its own part, for defending itself and for having its people believe that, and especially its military, believe that it had defended itself. And once those two aims were sufficiently accomplished, the crisis, fortunately, could blow over. The two sides could pull back. And there was a great deal of luck in that there wasn't more death, that Pakistani actions against India didn't lead to the deaths of more senior Indian officers or anything like that. Bombs dropped didn't kill people who would then require additional retribution. Pilot returned, and so on. All of those things were, I think, in my view, relatively lucky and had relatively less to do with U.S. pressure. So yes, Rubio, to answer your question, Rubio will hop on the phone as much as he can to try to introduce restraint. But I think it will ultimately depend on India and Pakistan to bring about that restraint. And I'm concerned, not because I think they ultimately want to go to war. I don't. I think the fear has more to do with the spiral, escalatory spiral, tit for tat actions. One side believes that it needs to settle the score with the other, and the possibility that that requires more and more as you go through a crisis. That's the concern.
Let me at this point, Dr. Markey, pull back and ask you a question, both as an American academic and as an analyst who's been studying South Asia for many years. What's your assessment of the ability and the capacity of the two armies? How do they match up to each other?
Well, I take seriously the idea that, if you're looking at a crisis situation, that they stack up in ways that do not redound significantly to the benefit of either side. Ultimately, India, being a much bigger country, a bigger power, and a bigger military, has advantages over the long term with respect to Pakistan. But in the near term and on the border, what you see is something that looks more like a stalemate. Pakistan does have the ability to respond reasonably effectively. That's what we've seen in the past. And India hasn't added to its military capability yet in ways that would fundamentally alter that. Meaning it doesn't have considerably more aircraft. What we haven't seen is the introduction of other features of the militaries of either side. So, there is a possibility that you could see missile strikes. And that was something that we worried about in 2019 into Pakistan. But Pakistan also has missile capabilities. And so India would have to be concerned about that escalatory potential. We haven't seen the significant additional use of drone warfare or other things that have been used in other theaters. So it's possible that if this crisis were to drag on, we'd see some interesting and different dynamics that, frankly, again, here in Washington would look more destabilizing and worrisome in terms of escalation. But you don't have an overwhelming advantage on India's side. And I would add one other feature here, which is, of course, the China angle, which I think gets too little attention. Of course, India has been more concerned about its border with China since at least 2020 than it has in some ways about its border with Pakistan, and has had to shift forces away from the Pakistan front to deal with that China front. And that means that India also has to have one eye on the China front throughout any crisis with Pakistan. And to some extent, that's always been true. But I think here in 2020, that's even more true than it was in 2019. And perhaps that introduces a degree of caution on India's part that might not have been there in the past, because it's concerned that it's not just dealing with Pakistan, that it might be dealing with a China problem as well.
Is this a theoretical concern that the Indians should be conscious of and worried about? Or do you think there is a real possibility that if the situation between India and Pakistan spirals out of control to Pakistan's detriment, the Chinese will come in to assist their ally?
Yeah, my view is that the Chinese have no interest in being directly involved in an immediate conflict scenario or crisis scenario between India and Pakistan, except, of course, as the looming threat off to the side. But they have said that they have a fundamental interest in their partnership with Pakistan, and that anything that would be perceived as an existential threat to Pakistan would be of concern to China. And so I think I interpret that as they wouldn't hop in at the early stages, but they might hop in at the later stages if something, if this actually escalated to something that looked more like a war. And India can't be certain where the earlier and later stages, where we shift from earlier to later in a crisis. And so, as I say, India should have one eye on the China front as well.
Against this background, Dr. Markey, let's pull back a little and talk about the steps the two countries have taken against each other, because Washington's response to those steps is equally important in trying to understand how Washington views this crisis. The most serious step taken by India is to suspend the Indus Waters Treaty. And given that these waters account for something like 80% of Pakistan's irrigated agriculture, and I'm told somewhere between 20 and 25% of the country's GDP, this was a step that causes anxiety, if not panic, in Pakistan. How is it viewed in Washington?
The view is mixed, I think, here. And I can say that on the one hand, this is a profoundly threatening, certainly to Pakistan, and in some ways unhelpful or perceived as unhelpful measure here in the States, because this is one of the few aspects of the India-Pakistan relationship that has persisted, a treaty that has persisted since 1960, that has been generally accepted despite all the many conflicts between India and Pakistan, and which bears directly on the well-being of certainly Pakistan's many 250 million people in ways that shouldn't at some level be disrupted, even when the two sides come to blows as they have. And so that part is seen as unhelpful. I would say, sort of in the back of people's minds here, on the other hand, this is a symbolic gesture. India doesn't have the capacity, doesn't seem to be turning off the water to Pakistan overnight. It's not a flip the switch. This is a kind of a general signal of India's frustration, anger, and deeper concerns about the direction that Pakistan is going. And in that respect, because the treaty and the flow of water, putting the treaty in abeyance doesn't turn off the water overnight, it means that this is signaling. And signaling in a crisis is not a bad thing, particularly when it's potentially relatively low cost. That is, if India's government is able to signal to Pakistan its seriousness without introducing a real cost, that is, the lives of people, but Pakistan receives the message and understands that it needs to come to the table with a better deal for India, well, then India can achieve some of its purposes diplomatically. And that, I think, would be welcomed. So there's a kind of a bifurcated response to this, and the one level it's seen as unhelpful, maybe dangerous. Certainly over the long term, it would be a bad thing to have a breakdown in water sharing. And of course, as many Indian analysts have observed, it would also implicate China too, where India is the lower riparian and is concerned about Chinese putting their arrangements into abeyance in the same way. So India could pay a cost for this. So in all those ways, it's negative. But in the terms of finding measures in a crisis to signal anger, short of dropping bombs, that is a good thing.
Let me then come to Pakistan's response. Pakistan has said that any attempt to stop or divert the flow of water would be met by what it called the full force across the complete spectrum of national power. And that is a clear threat to use nuclear weapons. Does Washington believe that's a serious threat or a bluff?
Again, it's a signal. The problem with countries that have nuclear weapons is that when they signal, even indirectly, that they are willing to use these weapons, it has to be taken seriously. No one can be sure whether it's a bluff or not. With Pakistan in particular, they do not have a doctrine of no first use. Their doctrine is quite different. And so there's been all kinds of concern in Washington that Pakistan's kind of free use of the nuclear or rattling of the nuclear saber is worrisome. And that's been worrisome to us for decades now. And so, so we have to take this seriously. But again, it's in the context of signaling, of what might happen if something else happens, and that something else hasn't happened yet, and probably, as when it comes to turning off the water, won't happen quickly, and hopefully won't happen anytime soon.
Now, in retaliation, as you know, Pakistan has threatened to hold the similar agreement in abeyance.
Yeah.
For 50 years, this agreement has not only recognized the old ceasefire line as a line of control and therefore the de facto border in Kashmir, but it's also ensured that the two countries will resolve issues bilaterally and peacefully. So how does Washington view the threat to put the agreement in abeyance if that threat is actually implemented?
I don't think that particular threat has registered all that much in Washington. I think, first of all, it's complicated and, as we would say here, a bit inside baseball. That is, most people are unfamiliar with terms of this treaty, and you've sketched them out effectively. But I don't think that's made a huge dent in terms of how Washington has seen this. And what would that actually mean? It would mean that the two sides would not fully accept the border. Well, I'm not sure that they fully accepted the border anyway. And the idea of going to a kind of multilateral forums to plead Pakistan's case doesn't strike me as a terribly serious threat to India, or certainly not a grave concern to the United States. So again, this is in the category of signaling. It would be unhelpful if Simla would break down. That is another kind of long-standing pillar, to the extent that India and Pakistan have them, of some degree of understanding between the two sides. So it would be unfortunate to see that break down, but it is very much in this category of signaling in crisis, and to show that Pakistan is serious. Again, the points about all options being on the table, this is the kind of things that countries do when they want to be clear that they will respond, that India cannot exact punitive revenge without expecting Pakistan to do something as well.
Now, Shehbaz Sharif, the Pakistan Prime Minister, has suggested a transparent and neutral investigation, possibly done, I think, by a third party. India has so far either ignored that suggestion, and certainly it's not likely to accept it. How do you think the Trump administration would view this suggestion of transparency, of neutrality, and perhaps the third party carrying it out?
Probably with some suspicion. Would be my answer. And that is with greater sympathy for India's concerns than Pakistan's on this score. And I say that because in the past, the US experience with these investigations with Pakistan has not been terribly good, and recognizes that India's experience with these investigations has not been terribly good. So sees the promise of an investigation or the call for an investigation as a kind of a stalling tactic. And something that the United States has witnessed before. So on the one hand, it's going to be suspicious about these things. On the other, as I said before, in an effort to introduce a degree of restraint and to keep this from escalating rapidly, there might be some within the US system who would say, sticking to this idea is not a bad thing. That might slow this crisis down. And create opportunities and off-ramps to de-escalate. And that's something that the United States will ultimately, absolutely seek. And the question is exactly when in the crisis it will seek it. Will it seek it after India has taken its first shot and before Pakistan responds? Probably that would be a good time from a US perspective. But can it achieve that? Probably not. So then we're looking at a second round, and would it be able to introduce a degree of restraint on India's part after it's suffered from some yet unknown Pakistani countermeasures, and that's worrisome. So as I say, anything that can introduce a certain degree of restraint in the near term might be welcome in certain quarters, but there's going to be some suspicion about this particular mechanism.
Let me end, Dr. Markey, by raising a very different sort of question. Khwaja Asif, the Pakistani defense minister, in an interview to Yalda Hakim of Sky News, which has been very widely reported in this country, said, and I'm quoting him, Lashkar-e-Taiba doesn't exist in Pakistan anymore. He insisted, and I'm quoting him again, it's extinct. The Indians simply don't believe that. As someone who knows Pakistan and has studied Pakistan, do you accept what Khwaja Asif has said?
I don't. I don't think most people in the U.S. accept the deeper meaning of what it sounds like he was trying to say. Meaning, we do not accept that there are not, to put this in a positive term, we believe there are still anti-Indian terrorist groups based in Pakistan operating as if they were Lashkar-e-Taiba, if perhaps under different names, and pursuing their agendas against India. That is widely accepted here in the United States. If the defense minister is sort of playing games in terms of word choice, that's a different story. But the threat is real. Pakistan has never done quite enough to eliminate that threat. There is a debate in the United States as to precisely whether it could, if it chose to, turn off all of those anti-Indian groups quickly, or what cost that would require on the part of the Pakistani state, having nurtured them for so long, what kind of backlash that would bring about in Pakistan. All of those are relatively open questions, but that these groups still exist and that they probably were involved or responsible or indirectly supported this particular attack, you'll get few people in the United States questioning that.
So no one is taken in by Khwaja Asif?
Not this particular comment, no.
Dr. Markey, thank you very much for the time you've given me, and in particular, thank you very much for your understanding of how the Trump administration views the escalating crisis between the two countries and how it's likely to respond if it comes to military action. I'm extremely grateful. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you. Good to see you.
A pleasure.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.